This funding response for distressed companies in strategic sectors, what prompted that?
In 2008, it became clear that the international economic crisis wouldn't pass South Africa. And we did an exercise where we looked at which sectors are likely to be affected. And we wanted to try and prevent the loss of industrial capacity and try to save as many jobs as possible. So once the economic crisis passes, we're on a sound footing as a country.
Okay, now we do know that a lot of financial institutions loathe to lend, unable to generate funds. Where do you find over 6 billion rands to do this sort of thing?
We took a conscious decision at the start of the economic crisis that we wouldn't cut back. We wouldn't tighten our credit criteria. And in fact, in the last financial year, we managed to invest over 9 billion rand. We started to look for new sources of funding. We approached countries like China, which we hadn't traditionally received funding from. More recently, we also approached organizations like the Unemployment Insurance Fund to try and find new sources of funding to try and to reduce the cost of funding to the companies that we support.
All right, now I refer to the 6.1 billion rands that's been allocated to assist companies as a response to the crisis. What criteria do you attach?
The companies needed to be viable before the start of the economic crisis. They needed to obviously experience problems because of the crisis, but they'd need to show us that they've got a clear turnaround plan, that they would be viable as the economy turns.
All right, Andrew, do you want to comment on this one? I mean, obviously the IDC has been identified as a strategic bridge for development financing in the industrial policy action program of this government to support industrial development basically within the country.
Yeah, I think it has one of the most critical roles in this recession or crisis that we've seen, in that a lot of the focus when we talk economically is sort of on the bigger companies, on the JSE, the larger sort of entities, and the driving force of this economy ultimately will be your smaller and medium enterprises, and this is exactly where it's focused. The sad part about a recession that you see is as Shakeel quite correctly says, it's very often businesses that are relatively good businesses that run into trouble, and it's just the funding issue. It's not that the business plan is not viable. And so with the focus on companies with the potential to survive, it's a fantastic initiative, because those are often the companies that just don't have access to the credit.
Shakeel, going back to this idea of a company that was doing well and has the potential to survive, using Andrew's terms, how do you assess that? Because many of the small to medium industries have seen a 40% drop in their survival ratings. Many, as with big corporates, have had to rationalize and downsize and cut costs and do a lot of painstaking things just to keep afloat. And going forward, they're having to employ more expensive strategies for survival, and that's raising the question as to whether or not it's sustainable. And so this intervention may come in as a remedy now, a stopgap measure, but do you need to keep on pumping in resources?
We're very careful before we provide funding. We do a detailed due diligence. We'd send a team out to evaluate the business as a whole, the plans that they're putting in place, the restructuring plans. We'd talk to their customers, we'd talk to the funders. We try and work with the other banks to try and make sure there's a sustainable solution so that they stay in and restructure the funding. So we take a long-term view. And together with that, we try and structure the finance in such a way that it doesn't put pressure on the cash flow. So for example, we'd give them a moratorium on capital repayments or even on interest payments at times to make sure that during the difficult times they survive. And as things pick up, then they repay the facility.
All right, now you've identified companies within basically the metals fabrication sector, the motor industry, clothing and textiles, mining, and also forestry. Just let's talk about the what would be seen as the key dimensions of the South African economy: the motoring, the clothing and textiles, and mining.
The dynamics in those sectors have been slightly different. The motor industry has largely been impacted by the reduction in demand, international demand, in particular for exports. In forestry, it's been largely the drop in demand due to construction. Clothing and textiles has been under pressure for a number of years, largely due to imports. And the economic crisis has just made the situation worse.
Somebody would argue, why rescue a sector that is uncompetitive, that has shown that it can't survive the imports coming in from Asia? Sadly, lots of jobs have been lost. Many companies have closed down, but you can't, flog a dead horse.
I think that's correct, but what we try and do is identify the companies which are successful. There are a number of clothing companies which have niches where they are very competitive, and also they have the advantage of being close to the market. They can react quicker, they can produce in line with fashion demand, and there are always companies in any sector which have the potential to survive and even grow.
And with regards to mining, many people would say, yes, investments have become more expensive within mining activities. Exports have dwindled, especially in gold mining, for instance, output is lower. But there's also the constraints that have been introduced by the new mining charter, BEE legislation. In which area of the mining spectrum are you playing in? Are you focusing on new entrants, on the established miners, on specific areas of mining?
In terms of our general approach to mining, we try and focus on new developments, exploration, rather than acquisitions and changes within the mining sector. We look at different sectors, although we try to emphasize the more growing sectors rather than the more traditional areas like gold.
Okay, and let's talk about the metals fabrication. I don't really know what that entails. I could just assume sort of steel fabrication, ferrochrome and the like. But also the idea that within metals fabrication, we need to start developing manufacturing competencies in South Africa.
I think that's exactly the point. If we want to be successful as a company in the long term, we need to strongly develop areas like metal fabrication, which actually form the base for other industries as well. If we start making more machinery locally, some of our other industries can become increasingly competitive.
Yeah, I think I agree with that 100%, because one of the criticisms has always been that we sort of mine the raw material and export it and the value gets added elsewhere, and then end up being net importers of the finished good. And so industries like that can really play a pivotal role in sustainable development, actually creating value in South Africa.
All right, now so far 3.1 billion rands has been committed to some of these distressed companies in 53 transactions. So you're halfway and you've got more to go. And you're hoping to create about 17,500 jobs. In what way?
Now, the 17,500 jobs are through the money that we've already approved. Those are the jobs that have been saved. Or new jobs created in some cases. Through the remainder of the money that we put in, we hope to add to that, build on that, and actually save more jobs.
Is that also a criterion when you're looking at a company and whether or not it's got longevity? Is the extent to which it's an employer?
Very much so. It's not a prerequisite in that we would only save a company that is a large employer, but one of our focus areas is to try and save as many jobs as possible.
Okay, Andrew, do you want to add to this particular issue now, moving beyond this IDC bailout of companies, the idea that development finance institutions will be used as vehicles for job creation, vehicles for new industry development, and can the IDC do it alone? I know that there are a few others sectorally, but a lot of pressure is being put on the IDC.
But I think the IDC, as we said, plays a massive role in this. I think we saw last week an announcement that they were looking at exiting from about 26 billion rands of a 60 billion rand equity portfolio over the next 5 years to use as a source of funding for smaller businesses, and obviously have a role to play in that. And as we've said, is that the biggest issue at the moment is with tight credit criteria, banks shoring up their balance sheets, is funding is the issue, and so they certainly have that role to play.
Do you often feel like you're overwhelmed, not you personally, but the IDC?
When we look at the challenges the country has, sometimes it makes you feel that way, but we, as an institution, as a state-owned institution, we need to play that role, and we need to identify the areas where we can have the maximum impact and continue plugging away at it.
Okay, and going forward, you're going to be workshopping some of these issues concerning the fund. You're going to conduct or create fora where various stakeholders can come through. Have you already identified the businesses that you want to help, or can people still come forward and say, this is who we are, we'd like an intervention?
We've already started a process of workshops, but the idea there is to communicate what we can do so that people are free to approach us for finance. In fact, we'd welcome new approaches for finance. We'd want to support as many companies as possible, and in fact, a decision that we've just made is that we want to go a little further in terms of supporting these companies, and where we normally charge, like any other financial institution, fees. We've decided to waive these fees for companies that apply for us for distress funding.